What if I told you a towering creature saved my life in the middle of a forest, and no one believed me? I'm Nora, a biologist, and I was trapped deep in black pine, rescued not by a person, but by something that shattered everything I thought I knew about science and faith. Here's the truth no one talks about. There's something out there, ancient, intelligent, and watching. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. One look, and I knew. I wasn't alone. This isn't a campfire story. In this journey, I saw branch symbols laid out like messages, machines mysteriously sabotaged, and people running in fear, all while the world mocked the legend. Not anymore. 50 years ago, a woman named Greta was saved by a young Bigfoot. Now, that same creature, fully grown, pulled me from the edge of a cliff. 2 women, 2 lifetimes. 1 secret, hidden in the trees. If you skip this, you'll keep believing humans are the only ones who protect what they love. But once you see what I saw, you'll realize the forest isn't silent. It's guarded. They warned me about the Black Pine Forest before I ever set foot near it. Not in the scientific journals or the ecological databases I used to live by, but in the pauses between conversations at the diner on Route 12. In the look the realtor gave me when I asked about rental properties near the northern perimeter. There was a silence in those hills that felt like it had teeth. But I didn't come here for legends. I came for data, for patterns of moss growth on ancient pines, from migratory inconsistencies in the red fox population. I was 2 years out of Berkeley, carrying student debt and a grant from an institute that never once asked if I believed in monsters. I rented a small house at the edge of the woods. The owner, Greta, had eyes like river stones and a voice that hung in the air like campfire smoke. She'd once been a field researcher too, before some event in the 70s ruined her name in the scientific community. She said she saw something no one else did, said she tried to tell them, said they called her crazy. I didn't press, not then. My first 2 weeks in Black Pine passed with the usual rhythm: measure, record, repeat. Every night, I cataloged my recordings and uploaded what I could, though signal was patchy at best. On the 17th day, I hiked into a ridge area I hadn't yet mapped. The light was strange, foggy but golden, like the forest couldn't decide between dream and memory. That's when I heard the click. I barely had time to look down. 1 step, and the trap clamped around my ankle with the kind of force that felt personal. I screamed. God, I screamed so loud I expected someone to come running. No one did. The trap wasn't rusty. It wasn't forgotten. It was intentional. I tried to pry it open, but my hands were shaking. The metal bit deep. Blood soaked into my sock. The trees seemed to pull back as the light drained from the sky. Then, silence. At first, I thought it was hypovolemic shock, or maybe some predator waiting for me to bleed out. But then I saw the shape. It didn't move like a bear, and it wasn't cautious like a wolf. It didn't blink. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Massive shoulders hunched, arms loose at its sides like it didn't fear anything. I remember the eyes first. Not wild, not panicked, just present, watching me, calculating something I couldn't name. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. It knelt, slowly, like it had done this before. Hands as big as dinner plates worked the trap. I felt the release like a gunshot through my spine. It lifted the trap from my leg, tossed it aside into the trees, then stood again. I blinked, and it was gone. Not into the trees, not behind a rock. Just gone. As if the forest had taken it back. I crawled 3 miles that night. The pain was unreal, but I didn't want to sleep out there. Not with that thing. Not with the questions. By the time I made it back to Greta's cabin, my leg had swollen to the size of a melon. She didn't ask why I was bleeding, just helped me inside, pressed wet herbs to the wound, and said softly, "Some things out there don't like traps." I slept like I was being held underwater. The next morning, I remembered something. I'd had my field recorder clipped to my pack. It had been running, automatically. Always did when I entered a new grid. I limped to my laptop, slid in the SD card. Most of the file was static. Probably interference from the metal trap or the dampness. But in the middle of the garble, I heard it. A breath. Not the wind. Not an animal panting. A long, guttural, deliberate exhale that came right before the trap opened. As if whatever had freed me exhaled in relief. I played it again, slowed it down. There was something in that breath. A texture, like it had traveled through something older than lungs. Like the earth had exhaled through someone else's ribs. I didn't tell anyone. Who would I tell? Instead, I backed the file up 3 times and hid the drive behind the loose panel in the floorboards. Greta told me not to mess with. She saw me limping later that day, just raised her brow and said, "You're lucky it was the forest that found you." That night, the fog rolled in heavier. It moved across the hills like a living thing, curling around the pine trunks, brushing against my windows like fingertips. I stayed up, listening, not for the breath, not even for footsteps. I was listening for that silence again, because what scared me most wasn't the thing I saw in the forest. It was the feeling I had when it looked back at me, like I was the one being studied, like I was the anomaly, and deep in my gut even then I knew. This wasn't the end of something. It was just the first footprint. The morning after the breath, I started to see the forest differently. It wasn't just about what lived there anymore. It was about what trees no longer felt like background. They pressed inward, thick with quiet judgment. I had grown up believing in reason, in cause and effect, but now, something irrational had launched itself in my thoughts, and it moved every time the wind shifted. I set up trail cameras. Motion-activated, infrared, silent. I told myself it was for research integrity, but really, I just wanted proof I wasn't unraveling. I planted 2 near the ridge where I'd been trapped, one facing a narrow deer path that led down into a creek bed. The forest, for all its stillness, had patterns. Broken branches at odd angles, stacked stones that hadn't been there the week before. I started taking photos, drawing lines in my notebooks, mapping where trees had fallen unnaturally. At first I thought I was losing it. Then I realized these weren't accidents. They were signs, arrangements. Greta saw me hunched over the floor, surrounded by maps and memory cards. She laughed, not cruelly, but with the weariness of someone who'd been in that same posture decades ago. "It doesn't come when you chase it," she said, setting down a jar of tea that smelled like pine and something older. "It comes when it chooses." I asked her what she meant. She just walked to the window and nodded at the forest. "Not everything out there wants to be named." I pressed her. Asked her what she'd seen, what had made her leave the university all those years ago. Her face tightened. "Some truths have no place in papers. You start asking the right questions, and the silence answers back." She tapped the window glass. "And out here, silence is a language." I thought it was just mysticism, a way of making peace with isolation. But that night, when I reviewed the camera footage, something slid beneath my skin like ice. There it was, in the background. A sliver of movement, not from the trees, but behind them. As I watched myself adjusting the camera, something massive shifted in the shadows 10 feet behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't react, because I hadn't seen it. Not then. I rewound, played it again. The frame flickered, but it was there. A silhouette too tall, too broad-shouldered to be human. No facial features, just presence. Heavy, deliberate. And it vanished the moment on an hour frame. I stared at the screen for an hour. Not out of fear. That presence, it felt like the eyes from the night in the trap, as if it had followed me back and never really left. From then on, the forest changed its posture. Birds fell silent too early. The underbrush rustled when the air was still. One afternoon, I followed what looked like a trail, only to find branches snapped at perfect right angles, laid out like arrows, not randomly, not chaotically, but guiding me somewhere. Instead, I went back to Greta, more desperate now, my rational brain buckling under the weight of uncertainty. "There's something in these woods," I said. "It's not a bear. It's not any known species. But it's out there, watching, thinking." She didn't blink. Just said, "And now you understand." "Understand what?" "That I was joining her in exile? That the truth doesn't make you free? It makes you unpublishable?" She walked to her bookshelf and pulled out an old field guide. Inside, between pages on elk migration and fungal colonies, were hand-drawn symbols, arrows, circles, stacks of lines that matched the patterns I'd seen out there. "I've been marking the forest for generations," she said. "They just never learned to read it." I couldn't tell if she was being poetic or precise. My instinct screamed both. Later that night, I sat on the porch, recorder in hand, but no words came. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of moss and wet bark. My injured ankle throbbed with each breath. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a story too large to write down. Then came the sound. Not loud. Just a single crack of a branch from deep in the woods, followed by stillness so perfect it felt manufactured. Then another, closer, not random. Each step was calculated, measured. I held my breath, listening to the cadence. Not animal, not panicked. And then nothing. I waited for hours, the recorder humming beside me. At dawn, I retrieved the trail camera nearest the sound. The footage was uneventful until the final frame. Just before sunrise, the camera had captured a still image. In it, the tree line split slightly, and there, framed by light like a half-finished memory, stood the outline again. Upright, motionless, as if waiting. The air around me pulsed with something wordless. I didn't feel threatened, but I didn't feel safe either. I felt accountable, like I'd wandered into a conversation that had started long before I was born, and whatever was speaking had finally paused for me to answer. I showed the photo to Greta. Her hand shook, barely, as she traced the edges. "It doesn't want fame. It doesn't want fear. It wants the forest left alone." I asked her how she could be so sure. She met my eyes and for the first time didn't look away, because I've seen the alternative. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking out the window, past the darkened pines, into a forest that now felt too alive. I kept thinking about the figure behind me, how it didn't make a sound, how it couldn't do anything to me, and didn't. And when the wind moved through the trees in a slow, deliberate wave, I realized something I hadn't before. It wasn't trying to hide from me. It was trying to decide if I belonged. The first time I saw the Terra Corp trucks roll past Greta's porch, I thought they were lost. 4 black SUVs and a utility trailer with out-of-state plates. No logos. Just a dusty yellow permit, taped to the windshield, like it gave them permission to rearrange the world. But they were surveying. That same afternoon, a sign went up along the service road. "Environmental impact study in progress. Do not disturb." I'd drilled it into a cedar older than this country. I watched the sap bleed like it was trying to scream. Greta didn't say a word, just stood at the tree line with her arms crossed, and that expression she wore when she didn't like how the air smelled. By nightfall, there were 4 more vehicles parked by the trailhead, equipment cases stacked beside them like coffins without lids. I wanted to believe the intrusion was temporary, a paperwork fluke. I walked down to their camp with my badge, my data, my credentials, introduced myself to a field coordinator named Dawson, ex-military, buzz cut, handshake like sandpaper. I tried to explain the fragility of the biome, the undocumented flora. He smiled like he was tolerating a mosquito. "We're just looking." Looking, that word took on a different weight now. When I got back to my cabin, I logged into my server to download backup footage, planning to organize a report that might stall their operations. But something was wrong. The folders were empty, not corrupted, erased, logs gone, metadata gone. It wasn't a crash. It was a wipe, remote, clean. My notes were untouched, my physical recordings still in their cases, but the cloud had been vacuumed. I remember walking outside, barefoot on the dirt, and feeling the forest hum beneath me, as if it knew, as if it was waiting for my next move. The following morning, one of Terra Corp's quadcopters crashed near the creek bed, No visible damage, no wind that day. The drone just fell. Hard. They blamed battery failure. But I watched the tech guy's face. He looked rattled, like the drone had dropped out of something colder than air. Over the next 3 nights, their generators shut down without cause. Laptops froze. Tents collapsed. And yet no one saw anything. No footprints. No trespassers. No wildlife damage. Just silence where noise should been. Like the forest had erased them frame by frame. One morning they found a sensor rig mangled in the brush. Wires pulled out, housing crushed. I heard them whispering about sabotage. About locals. Dawson started keeping a sidearm on his belt. But it wasn't people. You could feel it in how the trees swayed. How the birds no longer sang near their camp. I watched a squirrel stop mid-run on a branch and stare into the dark unmoving for 10 full seconds before bolting in the opposite direction like it'd seen the end of something. I tried talking to the local community, thinking maybe someone would speak up. But doors didn't open. Phones went unanswered. There was a look in their eyes now that matched Greta's. A shared memory no one dared name. By the 5th day, one of the workers quit. He didn't pack his gear. Didn't tell his team. He just drove down the access road at dawn, tires spitting gravel like they were fleeing a crime scene. That afternoon, I found his hard hat tossed near the edge of the tree line, snapped clean at the brim. Later that night, as rain started to fall, I heard heavy boots climbing my porch. Greta opened the door before I could. It was Dawson, soaked, pale, shaking in a way no soldier should. His voice cracked when he spoke. I saw it. He didn't wait for us to ask what. It wasn't human, he said, eyes unfocused. But it looked close. Standing up on that hill right above the camp, just watching. It didn't blink. He left without drinking the tea Greta poured. Drove off like the forest might change its mind if he didn't move fast enough. We didn't sleep that night, not because we feared it would return, but because, for the first time, it had chosen to be seen. At dawn, the fog hung lower than usual. Almost metallic in how it caught the light. I walked the ridge alone. Drawn by something I couldn't name, I found broken limbs. 3 thick pine branches snapped at chest height, arranged in a V pointing north. A direction. A warning. The forest didn't want us gone. It wanted them gone. And it was starting to act on that. I didn't ask her to tell me. I think some stories only surface when the forest decides you're ready to hear them. And maybe that night, something in Greta's bones told her the silence had waited long enough. The power had gone out again. The rain was soft, drawing like fingers along the tin roof of her cabin. We sat by candlelight, the air thick with the scent of sage and something older. Greta held a mug in both hands like it anchored her in time. It was 1972, she said, voice low, not looking at me. I was younger than you, more reckless. Thought I could catalog everything with a clipboard and a camera. She paused, eyes flickering toward the window, as if watching the dock for confirmation. I was wrong. She had been part of a wildlife tracking project back then. Short-term grant, 2 seasons of field work, no real oversight. She'd been alone on a trail one dusk, trying to locate a tagged lynx. Instead, she stepped into a riverbed that wasn't supposed to be there, broke her leg in 2 places, and passed out before she could call for help. What woke her wasn't pain, it was breath. Not hers. When she came to, she was slung over a shoulder, carried through the forest like she weighed nothing. She tried to scream, but something in her gut told her not to. The movement wasn't careless. It wasn't violent. It was deliberate. Gentle. She was placed near a fire built with stone and damp moss. Her leg was packed with something cool and pungent, ferns and roots she didn't recognize. For 2 nights, she drifted in and out, and each time she surfaced, she saw the shape nearby, watching, breathing. It was tall, massive, covered in dark hair, but not filthy. Eyes like warm coals, hands that moved slowly, almost apologetically. It never made a sound, never fed her, but left fruit and wild herbs nearby. And on the 3rd night, it held out a stick and scratched symbols into the dirt. Greta's fingers trembled as she spoke. It was trying to teach me something, a language, not words, ideas, shapes, feelings. I didn't interrupt. She pulled out a box wrapped in faded cloth and placed it on the table between us. Her hands lingered on the knot for a long moment before unwrapping it. Inside, cushioned in old wool, was a tooth. Not human, not bare, black, matted. Its texture wasn't smooth. It spiraled like bark weathered by decades of wind. There was no gloss, no polish. But it felt alive, even across the table. I felt the weight of it in my chest. "I found it beside my bed the morning it disappeared," she whispered. "Like a thank you, or a farewell." She never saw it again. When she returned to the university and tried to publish her account, the institution shut her down. Colleagues distanced themselves. One advisor said she'd suffered a breakdown. They rewrote her data, reassigned her work, and just like that, she was gone from the scientific world. Swallowed by the same silence that had once sheltered her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I held the tooth in my hand. It wasn't cold, like I expected. It felt like touching the core of an old tree, as if it remembered. Back in my cabin, I laid it beside the sketches I'd made from the camera footage. The shapes matched. Not perfectly, but enough to make my heart hitch in my throat. Circles, intersecting lines, paths. I remembered one of the gestures Greta had made the week before, when she'd shown me the symbols in her field guide. She'd touched her temple, then her heart, then pointed to the trees. At the time I thought it was poetic. Now I understood. It was a phrase, a sign. I see you. I understand. I won't betray this place. The next morning, I walked deeper into the forest than I ever had. No camera, no recorder. Just the sketchbook and the tooth in my pocket. I passed 3 downed trees, arranged like an arrow. Followed the path through a section of woods where the light never quite touched the ground, where every sound felt edited out of existence. I stopped at a clearing marked by stones in a spiral. In the center, something had been left. A bundle of dried herbs tied with vines, resting on a flat rock. It wasn't for me, but it had been placed where I would find it. I knelt and left the tooth there, quietly, like an offering returned to the altar. Not out of fear, not even awe, but respect. Behind me, a branch creaked, not breaking, just shifting. I didn't turn around. I whispered, "Thank," and kept walking. Later, back at the cabin, I opened Greta's notebook again and traced one of the oldest entries, written in shaking hand, barely legible. It wasn't a sentence. It was a symbol, a knot, looping in on itself, closed, but breathing, the same kind Greta had taught me to tie from twine when I first moved in. She'd used it to bind firewood. I hadn't thought of it as anything but practical. Now I saw it everywhere, on her garden gate, on her mugs, carved faintly into the lintel above my door. It wasn't decoration. It was a message. And suddenly, I knew with a clarity it split my ribs like a blade. The creature who'd pulled me from the trap hadn't just saved me, it had known who taught me that knot. The machines came at dawn. Their engines cracked the morning silence like bones snapping in winter. I stood on Greta's porch as the first bulldozer inched toward the southern edge of the forest. An orange monster with steel teeth, chewing the earth one bite at a time. No more permits, no more surveys, just raw intention. They weren't hiding it anymore. I'd filed everything I had, sketches, sightings, damaged equipment logs. But it wasn't enough, not for the agency, not for the press. The story was too soft. No hard footage. No names willing to speak on record. They called it a fringe tale, said if I kept pushing, I'd risk my career. As if I had one left to lose. Greta watched them too. Arms folded, eyes heavy. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. Now it was our turn. By mid-morning, the air tasted of fuel. Trees groaned as blades touched bark. I drove the back roads until pavement gave way to mud, tracing the map Greta once etched from memory. She had whispered about a place deeper in, far beyond the known trails, where paths ended and something older began. She called it the hollow inside the world. I never thought I'd go there, but I also never thought I'd stand helpless while the oldest trees I'd ever known were torn apart like cheap paper. Halfway through the first descent, my phone died, though it was at 70%. The radio shut off next. Just static. The forest around me thickened. What light made it through the canopy bent in strange directions, casting shadows that didn't follow my movements. I gripped the wheel tighter. Then came the curve, one sharp swerve. Too fast on wet dirt, and I was weightless. The car skidded sideways, hit a ridge, then flipped. I don't remember the scream, just the moment my skull struck the window and the world went white. When I came to, smoke curled from the hood. The windshield was webbed with cracks. My shoulder screamed. Blood pooled in my shoe. The forest was quiet again, sickeningly so. And then, through the haze of crushed metal and fire-scented air, a shape emerged. It wasn't walking. It was striding, massive, upright, covered in matted black and brown hair, dusted with pine needles. Its chest heaved with each step, muscles shifting like rivers beneath skin. And in its eyes, those same eyes I'd seen weeks ago, was something beyond fear, beyond thought, recognition. I didn't move, couldn't, but I wasn't scared. It reached the car in 3 strides, crouched, and with a grunt that vibrated through the metal frame, peeled the door open like tin foil. Its hand, bigger than my head, wrapped around my torso and pulled me free in one smooth motion. The forest spun around us as it carried me. Not fast, not running, just away, through wet brush and shadow, through ancient corridors of trees, untouched by sunlight for centuries. My vision flickered, but one detail snapped into focus. Its arm, the one holding me. Wrapped around its wrist was a band, twisted twine and old vine fibers, looped into a knot I knew by touch, not sight. Greta's knot. It wasn't random. It was an ornament. And in that instant, bleeding and half-conscious, I realized the thing carrying me wasn't just a creature. It was part of something, linked across time, across memory. A lineage, maybe, a kinship, a promise. It laid me down in a patch of moss beside a hollowed-out trunk, steam rising from its back in the cold air. It looked at me once more, then vanished between trees, like the forest swallowed it whole. When I woke, Greta was there, kneeling beside me, checking my pulse, her eyes damp but fierce. "You made it," she whispered. I wanted to ask how she found me. She just shook her head. "You were never alone out here," she said. Not from the start. In the distance, the sound of chainsaws died. Not abruptly, just slowly, one by one, like someone turning down the volume on the end of the world. Greta helped me to my feet. I winced as weight hit my bad leg. "You can walk," she said. "But where we're going, you'll need more than that." As we moved deeper into the woods, past fallen logs and stone markers, something shifted behind us. A low groan. Not machine, not man. The forest was waking up, not in anger, in warning, and we had only just begun to listen. The forest felt different after the crash. Not quieter, not louder, just more aware. As though it had finally turned its face toward us. Greta led the way, her steps deliberate, like each root and stone remembered her. I followed, still limping, body aching, but too hollow with anticipation to care. I could feel something pulling us forward, not gravity, not instinct, but history. We passed through groves where light didn't filter in the way it should. Trees grew in unnatural symmetry. Their trunks bore patterns, scars that weren't shaped by weather or time, but intent. I saw symbols etched into bark, some worn by moss, others fresh and raw. Circles, spirals, crossed lines, not language, but memory. We reached a ridge so overgrown it barely qualified as a path, then dipped into a basin hidden behind walls of thicket. The air was cool, still, almost sacred. Then we stepped into the valley. It was like breaking through the skin of the world. A hush fell over everything. No birds, no wind, Just a sense that time had paused to make space for something older. Trees here were giants, twisted, knotted, dripping with age. Beneath them, shelters shaped from woven branches leaned against stone. They weren't huts. They weren't crude. They were intentional. They were homes. And they weren't empty. At first, I thought they had hidden, but as we stood there, figures began to emerge. Not with fear, not even surprise, with recognition. Tall, broad, fur-covered forms stepped from between tree trunks and behind curtains of vines. One paused to tilt its head, studying us. Another moved to the side, revealing a younger one, no taller than my shoulder, who clung to its leg but didn't hide. I couldn't move. My throat clenched around something wordless. The one who had saved me, twice now, stood behind them, the twine bracelet still wrapped around its wrist. It stepped forward slowly, then knelt, not in weakness, but in something else. Deference, toward Greta. She stepped closer and placed her hand over her heart, then extended it outward in that same gesture she once used to mock a knot. The being mirrored her motion. They held the pose, just breathing, just being. This wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't even about understanding. It was about trust. A shared quiet born from decades of watching, of hiding, of choosing not to strike even when provoked. Greta turned to me. "This is why we don't speak," she said, barely above a whisper. "Because they never did. But they remember." I looked again. They weren't beasts. Their bodies were powerful, but their movements were careful, deliberate. I watched one help another spread leaves over an injured leg. A third poured water from a folded leaf into the mouth of the smallest one. It chirped, not a sound I recognized, but a tone I understood. Comfort. One of them crouched beside a hollow log and began arranging bundles of dried herbs in a pattern. Delicate, meticulous, almost meditative. I recognized one of the plants from Greta's old kitchen jars. It had no common name. She only called it smoke vine. Another brought a stone bowl, placed it in the center of the clearing, and dipped a carved stick into its thick contents. They painted symbols onto a slab of tree bark. Lines and curves so familiar, it stopped my breath. They were the same symbols Greta had shown me years ago, drawn from memory. Only this time, they were coming from the source. And something happened that rewrote the way I thought about everything I'd seen. The youngest stepped forward, clutching a bundle of sticks. It dropped to its knees, placed them on the earth, and began arranging them in a pattern, a spiral, then a line, then a curve. It wasn't random. It was the symbol Greta used when she first taught me the forests. Thank you. And I realized it had been learned from her. It had been remembered. They knew her, or they remembered the one she'd once known. The one who'd carried her from the riverbed all those years ago. It wasn't a singular incident. It was a lineage. They teach each other, and they remember. My legs nearly gave out. I sat on the soft moss, tears pricking behind my eyes. Not out of fear, not awe, but a sense of smallness I hadn't felt since childhood. This wasn't a discovery. It was an invitation, and it had come at great cost. The one with the bracelet approached me slowly, then reached out, not to threaten, but to offer. It pressed the back of its hand against my shoulder, just for a breath, then pulled back. The skin was warm, warmer than any human's, like stone left in the sun. We stayed until twilight. No words, no recordings, just the steady heartbeat of something that had always been there, just outside our understanding. As we turned to leave, Greta whispered, "We protect this now, not for science, not for proof, for them." I nodded, and behind us, as the valley folded back into silence, the youngest let out a single sound, a whistle, sharp, short, deliberate. I froze. It was the same note I'd heard on that static-filled audio file, the one I thought was breath. But this time I knew what it meant. It was saying goodbye, and it knew I'd come back. I didn't want to post it. Not at first. Every frame felt like betrayal. But Greta said something to me that I couldn't forget. You're not showing the world what they are. You're showing the world what we've refused to see. The footage wasn't dramatic. It wasn't chasing or growling or flickering eyes behind branches. It was stillness, breath, a rhythm of life that didn't match ours, but somehow mirrored everything we forgot how to be. In one clip, you could see the smallest one crouching by the fire, drawing patterns in ash. In another, an adult pulled bark from a tree with fingers too wide for surgical work. But the motion was precise, reverent. One frame lingered on a shared gesture between two figures, foreheads close, breathing in sync, the kind of quiet that could reset a life. I edited nothing, just added one line of text at the start. If you see them, don't chase. Just listen, don't chase. And I hit upload. The internet didn't take long to burn. Within hours, it spread like smoke under a locked door. First, the cryptid forums, grainy screenshots and panicked excitement, then Reddit, then cable news. By the next morning, a journalist from Portland called me while I was still holding a mug of untouched coffee, asking if I'd be willing to go on record. I hung up, not out of anger, just because her tone was all wrong. She was asking about proof, but what I had wasn't proof. It was presence. Then came the backlash. The skeptics. The influencers doing reaction videos where they laughed, paused, rewound, scoffed. One called it forest theater. Another said, Bigfoot with choreography. I turned the laptop off before I could hear more. But buried among the noise were others. Emails from rangers, from indigenous elders, from ex-military men who signed their names only as initials. I saw something like this in Montana, 1996. My grandmother warned me about the spirits in the hills. They don't scream. They just stand there. And they know when you're lying. A quiet tide was rising. One that didn't shout. One that just nodded. And then something shifted. A press conference aired from Washington. An official in a dull gray suit stood beside a Homeland Security backdrop, looking like he'd swallowed something sideways. His words were measured, slow. We are aware of the circulating footage. We are investigating its origin and authenticity. At this time, we ask for calm and discretion. He didn't deny it. He didn't laugh. 2 days later, Terra Corp released a statement calling the footage manipulated, the forest unremarkable, and all allegations of unauthorized development misinformed. But their site operation ceased within 24 hours. Their equipment disappeared, their name wiped from singage overnight. And then came Dr. Halloran. I hadn't seen his name in years, not since undergrad when I studied his work on Appalachian predators. He was a skeptic. He once wrote a 70-page paper titled Myth as Survival Instinct, the psychological function of cryptid lore. But there he was, on a live stream. His eyes were different now. Not smug, not tired, just unresolved. I watched the footage, he said quietly. Twice? Once as a scientist. Once as someone who remembers something I buried for 40 years. He paused, lips twitching. In 1981, I worked a field site in Alaska. My partner and I were cataloging grisly movement. One night, I wandered too far from base, got turned around in the cold. I should have panicked. I didn't. Because something was watching me, and somehow I wasn't afraid. He leaned forward. I saw the eyes. Not amber, not red, brown. Human but more patient than any human I've met. He looked straight into the camera, and I've never told anyone until now. That was when I knew it had shifted. Not just the conversation, the story. It was no longer about whether they existed. It was about whether we could handle the answer. Greta didn't watch the news. She didn't need to. She knew the forest would outlast the headlines, that no matter how loud the world got, the valley would keep breathing the same rhythm it always had. Still, she asked me to print out the image, the one of the youngest, drawing in the ash. I found her that night pinning it above her bed, beside a sketch from 1972. 2 generations. One gesture. We didn't speak much after that. There was no need. The forest was louder now, not in sound, but in presence. Birds returned. The air felt less brittle. Trees that had lost bark began to green again. I don't know if it was spiritual or just unnoticed science, but it was real. One afternoon, I returned to the trailhead and saw someone had carved a small spiral into the wooden signpost. It wasn't mine. It wasn't Greta's. Someone else had learned. Someone else had seen. We were no longer the only ones carrying the memory, and I wondered how many more had chosen silence, not out of fear, but out of respect. I kept the cameras packed. I never uploaded another frame, not because I was told to stop, because the story had already done what it needed to. But still, sometimes at night, I listen to the old recording, the one with the breath, and I hear it differently now. Not just exhale, not just sound, but a beginning, and somewhere, just past the reach of light, something exhales back. The official designation came quietly, buried under a string of policy memos and classified appendices. Black Pine was no longer public land. It had been redrawn on federal maps, locked behind vague labels like Strategic Ecological Zone and Restricted Survey Corridor. No announcements. No press releases, just a line drawn in silence, as if someone with real authority had looked into that valley and decided, no more. To the public, it was a curiosity that faded. A week of hashtags and open letters, conspiracy threads buried under newer scandals. The forest slipped back beneath the surface, exactly where it had lived for centuries. But for us, everything changed. Greta and I stayed. Not out of duty, not even to protect it. We stayed because there was no version of ourselves that fit anywhere else now. The world out there had become louder, faster, sharper. Here, things breathed in their own rhythm. Here, we weren't outliers. We were participants. I stopped uploading, shut down the website. The last entry was a single sentence. Not everything asks to be believed. Greta said nothing. But the next morning, she brought me a journal. Blank pages, stitched by hand, the leather soft and worn like old skin. I knew what she was telling me. Some stories weren't meant for crowds. They were meant to be carried, page by page, by those who had walked close enough to understand their weight. Seasons turned, spring unfolded like a sigh across the moss beds, and the trees bloomed slow and careful, as if still recovering. We worked in the garden. We mapped herbs by moonlight. Greta taught me how to read the wind, how to follow the direction of silence when sound refused to speak. Some nights, I thought I saw them, just beyond the tree line, shapes moving like memory, but I didn't reach for a flashlight. I didn't call out. If they needed me, they would come. Then one evening, I heard the whistle again, not loud, not calling, just placed. It came from the edge of the North Ridge, where the old river path used to run before the storm washed it out. I walked there slowly, heart thudding in quiet acknowledgement. At the base of a leaning pine, I found a bundle of sticks arranged in a shape I knew well. A spiral, a pause, and in the center, a stone. Smooth, obsidian dark, marked with a single groove. I touched it. It was warm. I didn't move it, just sat beside it, the air cool against my arms, and listened to the forest. It pulsed. Not in sound, but in sense. The way a room changes when someone walks in behind you before you turn around. I knew they were close. I knew they were listening. So I whispered, I remember. It wasn't a vow. It was a continuation. Later, when I played back the old recording, the first one, the night in the trap, I noticed something I hadn't before. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear it. Maybe it wasn't ready to be heard. But tucked inside the static just before the exhale was something else. Not a growl, not a warning. It was a whistle, short, deliberate, too structured to be random, too soft to be threatening. I looped it, over and over. It matched the one I heard that night on the ridge. It matched the child's call in the valley. It matched the way Greta used to signal for me from the other side of the garden when dinner was ready years ago before any of this began. Only now did I understand. It wasn't a word. It was a message, a closing of the loop. Thank you. I left the recorder running and stepped outside, just as the wind picked up through the treetops. The moon was rising slow and gold, caught behind the drifting shape of a cloud that didn't quite seem like a cloud. I stood in the doorway and felt the forest shift, not with fear, not with grief, but with memory. Because I've learned something since the beginning, since the trap, since the shadow and the fog, since the breath and the static. The forest does not forget. It does not forgive quickly, but it recognizes return, and it remembers kindness. So I write, not to prove, not to persuade, just to remind myself that I was there, that I wasn't dreaming, that in one forgotten valley, on one quiet night, something unspeakably old bowed its head, not because it had to, but because it chose to, and I bowed mine in return. That was the promise. And I have broken it. Sometimes, the most powerful truths aren't the ones shouted from mountaintops, but the ones whispered in the quiet spaces we forget to visit. They're not loud. They don't beg to be proven. They live in stillness, in the hush between wind gusts, in the hollow of an old tree, in the way moss creeps up stone with no need for permission. There are stories out there that never needed to be told to everyone. They just needed someone to listen without trying to own them. We live in a world obsessed with answers, with high-definition proof, with wrapping the unknown into something quantifiable. But maybe not everything sacred was meant to be dissected. Maybe wonder was never meant to fit inside the framework of certainty. Maybe the point was never to explain, but to feel, to stand in awe of something beyond ourselves, and let it remind us how small we are, and how deeply connected we still might be. Because in the end, the forest doesn't ask us to believe. It asks us to remember that not everything that matters can be seen, that silence is not the absence of meaning, it is its guardian, that the most ancient truths aren't buried under years, but carried forward by respect, by humility, by a willingness to accept that life doesn't begin and end with our species. There is something profoundly human in that acceptance, in choosing reverence over conquest, in realizing that sometimes the greatest form of knowledge is not exposure, but protection, not evidence, but care. There are parts of the world that survive precisely because they remain untouched, unseen, unspoken. And maybe the bravest thing we can do is allow them to stay that way. So if you ever find yourself at the edge of something that doesn't quite fit the rules, don't rush to label it. Sit with it. Let it speak in its own time, in its own way. There is wisdom in the quiet. There is grace in the unknown. And if, one day, the wild looks back at you, and you feel that pull in your chest, that sense that you're being seen, not as a threat, not as a witness, but as part of something greater, don't run, don't explain. Just breathe, and maybe, just maybe, whistle back. Thank you for walking this path with us, for stepping into the fog, and for staying long enough to hear what lies beyond it. If this story moved something in you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. Don't forget to follow, subscribe, and join us as we explore more mysteries whispered through the trees.